thank again, Matt, for joining us in this for this talk. We're very excited to have you here with us. So Matt is joining from Princeton University, where he is an assistant professor in computer science. His primary research is in algorithmic mechanism design and algorithm design where users have their own incentives. His research focuses on domains like auctions, cryptocurrencies, and more recently, social good domains. And before joining the faculty at Princeton, Matt spent 2 years as a postdoc at Princeton's CS theory group and was also a research fellow at the Simons Institute. So thank you so much, Matt, and please start whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks. So thanks also to the organizers for having me and for suggesting the topic. And I also want to note that both of the co-authors for the paper I'll discuss, Mariam Essaidi and Kira Goldner, are both in the room. And I think Kira has volunteered to answer questions as they come up in chat. But it's also fine if you want to raise your hand and interrupt. I think I hope the talk will be on the shorter side. So anyway, like the title suggests, I'm not going to focus the talk on the technical aspects of the research. But it was suggested that maybe it would be cool, since I started this project through one of the very early reading groups through MD4SG, that maybe I could, one, talk about the project, and two, just also talk about what that process was like. So anyway, so as I said, the paper that's going to come up is joint work with Mariam Essaidi, who's a student at Princeton, and Kira Goldner, who is a postdoc at Columbia. Hold on. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the project. It's related to healthcare exchanges, like how most of us purchase healthcare in the US. So it will be a little bit of a US focused project. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to propose a stylized model to capture the effects of limiting entry of providers to be able to sell their plans in the exchange that you're regulating. And the main result is just going to be some conditions under which limiting entry instead of letting all providers enter is going to improve the consumer utility. And the second thing I'll do is I'll just give kind of like extremely non-technical overview of kind of like what was it like working on this project and starting it through the MD4SG reading group and kind of like lessons that I picked up along the way. So I would say maybe kind of like when I think about what are the intended takeaways, I would say I hope that some people in the audience are maybe people who would identify as theory, who are students or either junior in that regard. And so you'll hear kind of like one story about what it was like for me to branch out into MD4SG and outside of my pure theory comfort zone. And if there are any domain experts in the audience who are not theorists, then maybe you'll get kind of a representative example of what it's like to work with one of us and get a sense of sort of like what we're good for, and definitely also maybe a little bit of what we're not good for. And I do want to get some high level takeaways of the research out, but I am not going to try to give any technical details. So the first thing I should do before going into this, just to give proper context, is I am really not an expert in healthcare. So you can ask questions about healthcare, and I or Kira will try our best to answer them. But one part of the story is we really relied heavily on Mark Shepard, who's an economist at Harvard, for his domain expertise, and we met him through the MD4SG reading group. That being said, I'm going to share very limited nuggets about healthcare, and I do feel pretty confident in those that I'll share. The other thing I want to emphasize is I am definitely not the first computer science theorist to work with domain experts, and I don't even think, like we're close to being the first to do that. But I would still say maybe the story will be relevant to people in the audience because the first time I did it was recent and it was through MD4SG. So I really intend for this to be more of a personal anecdote and not like a how to do research with domain experts talk. And I already noticed when I was looking at the participants, there are definitely people in the audience who have more experience with this than I do. So if you find it to be necessary or worthwhile to do, please feel free to override me during the discussion or to add more context to anything that I'm saying at the end. And the last thing is a disclaimer for the research itself. So the research itself, the model is stylized. So I would say that the style of research that I like doing, and that I would say I feel comfortable speaking for my community on this, is that our community likes doing, intends to give insight into one aspect of one relevant decision. And the style of research we do is not meant to capture all of the relevant factors that a real world designer would have to face. And so for this paper in particular, I really would say it is a theory paper motivated by healthcare exchanges, and you should not think of it as a pure healthcare paper. That being said, I do hope that the insight you get is relevant to healthcare exchanges, just because we did spend a lot of time working on the model with an expert, rather than just kind of like coming up with the best thing we could, only knowing auction theory. Okay, so that's all the disclaimers. Let me now get into, again, the first part of the talk will be on the research itself. So the motivation for this paper is purchasing, in this case, healthcare through a regulated exchange. So the setup to have in mind is that there's a regulator. So this could be the state you live in the US. It could be your employer. So in my case, I get my healthcare through Princeton, and Princeton regulates an exchange for me to purchase healthcare from. So what the regulator does is they set rules for the providers to offer plans. And in particular, one thing they might do is they might negotiate and they might restrict access to the market. So they might not let every provider who has a plan to offer show up in the exchange. But subject to these rules, the providers do kind of set their own prices or set their own parameters for what the plan is. But once this is done, the consumers purchase whatever plan they like at the offered prices through the exchange. So the two examples to have in mind. So in the US, there are some government managed exchanges. So the Affordable Care Act established exchanges in US states, and these typically do set some requirements on plans that they have to meet in order to be eligible to be offered on the exchange. But subject to meeting these requirements, any qualified provider can offer plans. And so I'll refer to this as something, I'll call this model the free market model. And the main important thing is that if you satisfy the requirements, then you can offer a plan. The second kind of exchange, which is how I get my own healthcare, is through Princeton. And so this is an employer managed exchange. And so large employers such as universities typically negotiate with a handful of providers. And so, for example, at Princeton, I have 2 plans that I can choose from, or a couple plans from each of these providers, but there are 2 providers, and it's United and Aetna. And only these providers are offering any plan through Princeton's exchange. So I'm certainly free to leave the exchange and get my own healthcare. But if I want to do it through the exchange, I can only get it through United and Aetna. So I'll refer to this model as the limited entry model, where Princeton has made it the case that it's not the case that every qualified provider can just show up and offer a plan on the exchange. Okay, sorry, so before getting into the model, which I'll do on the next slide, I'll say the main goal of the research is just to understand kind of under what conditions should you expect consumers to be happier with one model versus the other model. Okay, so here's the mathematical model that we're going to use to try and answer this question. So the providers are straightforward. There's just going to be n providers, and every provider, for simplicity, is going to offer a single plan. Every consumer is going to have a value for each plan. So there's n different plans. That means that the consumer is going to be represented by n numbers. And I want to think of there being kind of a population or distribution, depending on what language you're more comfortable with, over the consumers. So what I mean by that is maybe there's millions of consumers in the market. Every consumer has an individual valuation vector, which lists their value for each plan. And then I might think of this distribution as just drawing a random person from this population, or just talking about the fraction of people in the population that have a certain value. Okay, so what's the game? The only role that the regulator plays in the game is the second bullet here. But what's going to happen is each provider is going to set a price on their plan. The regulator is going to have a pre-specified rule, which says based on the prices set, which providers are actually going to enter the exchange. And then every consumer is just going to pick whichever plan maximizes their utility. So the 2 things I want to highlight here are, first, I'm only going to pick a plan that's actually in the exchange. So I have to pick the plan which maximizes my utility among the plans that are allowed to be in the exchange. And the second note is that actually I have to pick a plan, even if my utility is technically negative for all of them. So the motivation for this actually comes from, specifically in the US, there's a clause, or at least what made us think of this was there's a clause in the Affordable Care Act, which is called this individual mandate, which says that you're actually subject to a fine if you don't have health insurance. If you're not, if you don't want to model exactly the individual mandate, another way to think of it is that being uninsured is prohibitively undesirable, or getting healthcare not through your employer or through this exchange is prohibitively undesirable. So just think of it as you really need to get something through the exchange. Okay, and then the payoffs to the providers are just whatever fraction of consumers pick your plan, you get payoff equal to that fraction times the price you set. So the producers are just trying to maximize their expected revenue. And again, the question that we want to look at is how should the regulator choose which providers to let into the, sorry, I'm trying to move the Zoom thing so I can read the slide. How should the regulator choose which providers to let into the exchange so as to maximize the average consumer utility? And remember that the utility is their value for the plan they get minus the price that they have to pay. So that's what we're going to try and look at. All right. So with this in mind, I just want to give you one very quick small example to help get comfort with the model. So very simple example, there are two plans and two types of consumers. So one type of consumer, they like the first plan and they don't like the second plan, and the other type likes the second plan, they don't like the first, and the market is split 50-50. So let's just see what would happen in this free market approach. So the free market approach, you would let both plans into the market, and in equilibrium, both providers would set a price of 1. So I'm not going through the calculations for this, but I'm asserting that in equilibrium, those are the prices that would get set. So every consumer will then purchase the plan that they like best. And what will happen is the average consumer welfare will be 1, because everyone is going to get their favorite plan, which they have value 1 for. And the total provider revenue is also going to be 1, because every plan that's purchased has a price of 1. So what this means is the consumer utility is actually pretty low. The consumer utility is 0, but the welfare is high. With the limited entry, instead what will happen is if you only let the plan in with the lowest price, then in equilibrium, both providers will just drive the price all the way down to try to be the one plan that gets to be in the market, and the price they both set will be 0. And then what will happen is every consumer purchases the same plan, which is just the plan that's in the market. And what will happen here is that the average consumer welfare will be lower because only half the market is getting the plan they like, and half of them are getting a plan that they don't like. But the provider revenue, because the prices are 0, the provider revenue is low, and so the consumer utility is higher. It's actually a half in this case. So that's just one motivating example to have in mind to get comfort with the model. Okay. So in general, we're going to again try to compare the free market versus limited entry. So in general, free market would just be, in this game, the selection rule is all plans enter the market at whatever price they set. So what will happen is you will have higher welfare because there's going to be more plans in the market. So there's going to be more options for the consumers to choose from. But there's going to be less competition because the producers are only competing once they're in the market. So it's not that there's no competition. There is some competition, but they're not competing just to be in the market in the first place. For the limited entry model, we're going to just decide that we'll let the N-1 cheapest prices into the market. So we're just going to exclude the minimal amount of providers necessary to drive the prices down really low. Okay, so what will happen here is there will be fewer plans, and there will therefore be lower welfare because your favorite plan might not be in the market anymore. But because there's competition just to get into the market in the first place, there will be lower prices. So in particular, for the assumptions that we're going to make on the distributions we study, it will always drive the prices to 0. Okay, so then for the question of which one has greater consumer utility, it is going to depend. And the reason is that the utility is the welfare minus the revenue. So in the first case, there's higher welfare but higher prices. And so, but in the second case, there's lower welfare but lower prices. It's not obvious which way this trade-off will go. So that's the point of the model, is to try and understand what are some conditions on the distribution so that we can say something about which way the trade-off goes. Okay, so this is the one slide of results that I'm going to produce. So first is just what's the assumption? So the cases we're going to study are all going to be where the distribution is IID. Okay, so this is actually a common assumption from prior work. What I mean by that is that the consumer's value for each provider, you can think of that as being drawn independently from the same distribution. I'll refer to capital F will be that distribution. Okay, so there are two things I want to quickly discuss this assumption. Distribution being IID has two aspects to it. First, it's that the distribution is symmetric. And second, it's that it's a product distribution, that each of the marginals are independent. So the symmetric assumption, I actually think, we can kind of motivate that and say that what that means is that the plans are the same raw quality, but they're just tailored to specific consumers. So you might think, say, in an exchange, maybe all of the platinum plans are roughly the same quality, but some of them maybe have a really good network for someone with diabetes. Maybe they have a good network for someone who's a competitive athlete, or maybe they have good benefits for someone who is relatively healthy, something like that. So that's what symmetry means. And that is definitely a restriction, but I think that still captures a lot of settings. Independence assumption, that's really just a technical assumption to make the math tractable. And that's a common thing that happens in prior work, especially in anything that has to do with auction design. It's a common technical assumption, but I'm not going to try and motivate that with the connection to practice. Okay, so what are the two main results? So there's some notation at the bottom. I've kind of hidden that away from the theorem statement because I don't want you to focus too much on precisely what these terms are. But the main thing I want to highlight is that there is a closed form. It's just a closed form that requires an extra sentence to say what it is. So I think of theorem one is basically saying, when is it meaningful to talk about consumer utility in the free market setting? So I would say it's meaningful to talk about consumer utility in the free market setting when a symmetric equilibrium exists. And so one thing we show is that if a symmetric equilibrium exists, it must be when the providers set the following price. So what I mean by that is it could be that there is no symmetric equilibrium, but if there's a symmetric equilibrium, it's because every provider sets this particular price. Okay, so what is this price? The text is expanded at the bottom. It's the expected value of the hazard rate of the second highest of n draws from the distribution. And the second thing we show is that whenever F satisfies a technical condition that we call MHR plus and has decreasing density, then a symmetric equilibrium exists. We also show that it's not the case that a symmetric equilibrium generically exists, that there are distributions which are even monotone hazard rate for which a symmetric equilibrium doesn't exist. The second theorem we show, I think of as being useful for comparing when it makes sense to talk about welfare when it makes sense to talk about consumer utility in the free market model. How do you compare that utility with a limited entry model? So theorem two is saying actually which one is bigger. So again, I would highlight, maybe I won't read out loud this time, but there is a one sentence closed form description for the comparison that you need to make. And if this comparison goes one way, then it is better to limit entry. If it goes the other way, then it's better to do the free market. And the second thing we show is that whenever F is monotone hazard rate and decreasing density, then this condition holds. So what I would say is the takeaway from this, when I take both theorems together, is that theorem one says, subject to some conditions, it makes sense to talk about utility in the free market because a symmetric equilibrium exists. And theorem two says, when it makes sense to talk about consumer utility, that subject to some conditions, it is better to limit entry. Okay, so that's the main result. I'm just going to pause there because I can see the chat lighting up. So I'm just going to see if there's anything. Okay, cool. Kira's answering everything. So I will just keep going. Thank you, Kira. All right. And okay, so those are the results. And I'm just going to have one more slide talking about the paper itself. I just want to give a brief technical nugget. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the proofs. The proofs do have, a lot of calculations. You have to have a lot of calculations to show that something's in equilibrium and reason about equilibrium. But I want to highlight one technical nugget that makes the math a lot less messy than it otherwise needs to be. And so this is specifically maybe for people who consider themselves auction theorists. I think this might be a cool way to look at the problem. So let's try to think about, what does the best response condition look like for producers in the free market setting? So we're trying to see whether something can be a symmetric equilibrium. So we want to say, assume that the other n-1 producers all set the same price P. So this means that the consumer has utility equal to their maximum value for another plan minus P for their favorite plan that's not yours. Their utility for your plan is just their value for your plan minus the price you pay. What this means is that they purchase your plan if and only if their utility for yours is higher than their utility for their other. And that's, again, because we decided to study a setting where there's mandatory purchase, right? So you have to purchase something. And then just after moving, some stuff to the left and to the right, this gives you the following formulation. They purchase your plan if and only if this value on the left-hand side is bigger than the price you set. Okay, so what's the cool way to reason about this without going straight to ugly calculations? Well, if we define VI prime to be what's on the left-hand side, then we sell our product if and only if VI prime exceeds the price we set. So this now starts to sound actually a lot like a single buyer revenue maximization problem. So we have a distribution over VI prime, which is I'm going to draw VI, I'm going to draw the max value for the others, and then I'm going to take VI minus the max value plus P. I'll call that distribution FP star. So it depends on F because F defines the distribution of all the V's. It also depends on P because P is added here. Okay, but after defining this distribution, producer I's optimization problem to best respond is actually exactly a single buyer revenue maximization problem for this new distribution. So what does it mean to be a symmetric equilibrium? It's a symmetric equilibrium if and only if price P is the revenue maximizing price for this distribution FP star. And the nice thing about this is that, actually we know a lot about how to solve revenue maximization problems for a single bidder. So there's this awesome theory due to Meyerson that gets that we can use. There's still some calculations, but you can get a closed form condition in order for P to possibly be the revenue maximizing price for the distribution FP star. So I would say that's kind of like the one technical nugget that I wanted to highlight about the proof, is that at the end of the day, we really did turn it into an auction theory problem. And that's how we were able to get somewhat tractable conditions. Okay, so what's the takeaway? I would say, again, there's a stylized model to capture the trade-off of limiting entry. And what we said was, under standard assumptions, limiting entry does yield higher consumer utility. Again, I would like to emphasize that I like to think of this as maybe a starting point rather than a solution to healthcare. The technical nuggets I want to highlight is, from a technical perspective, it really is an auction theory paper. So like, once we, eventually settled on the model after spending a lot of time talking to a domain expert, once we made kind of this one realization that I showed you on the last slide about how to reason about equilibria, from that point onwards, it really was a single item auction theory paper. Okay, and I do just want to give one sample direction for future work. So I would say, anytime there's kind of a stylized model, the thought experiment I like to go through is, what do I think is the, what makes me most scared about trying to do anything from this project to say something about practice? So obviously there's a lot, but I would say what maybe makes me the most scared in this case is that the view on competition, I think, is really stylized, where we said that if you limit entry by just kicking out one person from the market, that is going to drive all the prices all the way down to zero, or that all the producers are going to be pricing at cost. I don't think I think that to me maybe seems like a overly optimistic view of what will happen with competition. And so if I were to continue working on this, things I would want to think about are other formats of limiting entry that seem closer to practice. So maybe let me pause here. I'll leave this on the slide for a second. I'll take another quick look at the chat. And it looks like Kira is still staying on top of everything. So I will.
Oh, I think there is a raised hand if you'd like to take a
Sure.
question, Matt,
Yeah.
from Gabriel Weintraub. Gabriel, feel free to mute yourself if you'd like to ask something.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Matt. Really interesting work. So one question I have is do you have any intuition about your condition? Like if you were to explain that condition to like a policymaker, how would you, is there a way of articulating it in English?
Yeah, good question. So I would say for the condition in the statement of theorem 2, I don't think that maybe Kira does, but I don't have a good English way to phrase the if and only if condition. I do have a good way to phrase the second one, which is just, MHR distributions are ones which have light, tails that are no heavier than the exponential distribution. So for the sufficient condition, I would say, unless you think that the tail is really heavy, then it should satisfy this limited entry condition. So to just repeat, I don't have a good way to describe the if and only if condition, but I would say that for the sufficient condition, it's the tail of the distribution should not be too heavy.
I see. I was wondering, we had this related work with Daniela Saban, and they're like, something that like played a key role is the extent of product differentiation. So basically, if there's a lot of differentiation, you don't want to limit entry, because then customers are not happy. Like, so sort of you're hitting your welfare part of consumer surplus too hard. So I wonder if there's any interpretation that I'm not. It's hard for me to reason out these distributions with respect to product differentiation, but I don't know, maybe worth thinking about.
So yeah, so it's possible. So if I remember correctly, I think Kira may know your paper better, so she may have more to say. But the other thing I would say with respect to if trying to view it through product differentiation, I would say if F is heavy-tailed, then that means that I should expect my favorite provider to be significantly better than my second favorite provider. And so then that sounds like there would be significant product differentiation. Whereas if F is light-tailed, I would expect there to not be a huge difference between my favorite and second favorite provider. And then it seems like less of a problem to kick out my favorite provider.
I see. Thanks. That makes sense. Thank you.
I'm just going to add in. I think that's exactly right. And if I recall correctly, Gabriel, in your paper, for this specific rule of limiting entry, you just look at the hoteling model, although you also look at a whole bunch of other rules. So I think part of the difference is that we're looking at these more general distributions as well, and so the conditions on the more general distributions.
Yeah. Now we're working on a follow-up that have also more general things, but but that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Let me go back to the last slide here. And if there are no other questions, I'll let Kira keep handling the chat. Okay, so I'll go on to maybe the second part of the talk, which is just kind of like, so no more technical content, but just kind of like the story of like, how did I get into this? And like I said, I'll repeat some of the disclaimers, which is that I'm definitely not trying to put myself out there as like an expert in doing theory related to practice. I'm confident there are people in this room who have done more of that than I have, but I'll still share my experience of learning how to do that through MD4SG. So the brief background about me, right? So I'm a computer science theorist. I work in algorithmic mechanism design. I have no formal training in healthcare or any other social good domain. And so the way that I like to describe myself, I would say to the extent that I have expertise, I have technical expertise, but not domain expertise. But of course, if you want to actually affect a domain, you need domain expertise. I really like to contribute to social good research when my background is useful. I've definitely learned that a lot of the time my background is just not that useful, but sometimes it is. And so the reason I got into MD4SG was because I wanted to find the domains where it was useful. And I would say, I do think mechanism design and that way of thinking is useful for a lot of the social good domains. So that's why, that's why the group got formed, and that's why I was excited to try and join it. Okay, so what happened? The story, I actually don't know how much the history is known among the people who are in the group now. But around 2016, this was when I was doing the last semester of my postdoc at the Simons Institute. Radiata Bebe and Kira Goldner started a small remote reading group. I think it was about 12 of us. And it was mostly filled with people who I would describe as technical experts, maybe with similar background to me. There were a few people who were different, but it was mostly from the theory side. And we basically had this remote reading group, and we covered various social good topics. We had about 3 presentations each, and we had a session on healthcare. And we invited Mark Shepard, who is this economist at Harvard, to speak. And it was actually really great. We just sent him a cold email, and he was like, sure, this sounds like a good use of time, and so I'll do it. And so what he did, so he gave a talk for us really on the basics of healthcare exchanges in the US. And he really made an effort to start from the basics. He made it really accessible to us. And, we let him know that we really don't know anything, but we really are interested. And he stuck around afterwards for a bunch of questions. We spent a lot of time with him trying to tease out possible directions. We spent a lot of time afterwards by ourselves trying to tease out possible directions. And so, yes, it was awesome that he responded to a cold email, but we were definitely as a group, we made a huge effort to stay hyper-focused during the talk to make sure we were making good use of his time and that he would want to continue interacting with us after. So what do we do afterwards? So I still don't think, at least for me, maybe for other people it is. For me, I don't think it was possible to just spend 1 2-hour session with him and then be like, cool, I know what I need to know about healthcare. Now I'll go do math. So we spent a lot of time after his talk trying to come up with potential formal models and problems to work on. And I went to Boston and visited with him. And the main thing I got from talking to him was that, everything was not good. And so we threw everything out and started again. And so I started on a different direction. And then I went back and we thought really hard about potential models and formal problems. He gave one of the plenary talks at MD4SG, the one that was at EC 2017. And we chatted with him again. We grabbed him. We were like, hey, sit with us for a few hours. And again, we kind of threw out everything that we started with and restarted again. Eventually, we sent him a bunch of emails. He was very kind and kept responding to us. And eventually, we got to the model that we settled on. And I just want to, emphasize about the process for me was that the only way to know that we had a bad model was we had to also start analyzing it. So we really kind of started and stopped a potential project like 4 times throughout this process. And we did quite a lot of math before realizing that it was the wrong model. And I don't know, again, maybe there are other people in the room who can say that that just means we did it wrong. But my takeaway was that that's just necessary if you want to get the model right. And you need access to the domain expert to tell you that the model's not right. So the fun part then, so once we nailed down the model, which again took a really long time, and I just highlighted that we needed to analyze the potential models along the way to get feedback. It's not like we said, okay, then we're basically at that point, I would say we felt like we had a project we could work on, and we didn't need to rely on Mark so heavily from that point forwards. Of course, we did make minor technical adjustments to the model once we got going, but at this point, it was mostly like a normal algorithmic game theory project. The maybe fun takeaway for me was that we also did just really turn it into an auction theory project. And I guess what I learned, you can really turn anything into an auction theory project if that's just like, that's what I like doing. And that's how I learned to learn about things. And it was possible to do that even for this healthcare question. But really from this point, it was really a typical algorithmic game theory project, which I imagine whoever the intended audience is for this part, you're used to that. But there was this extra step at the beginning, which was really talking with Mark quite a lot to try and figure out how to get started. So it's also suggested that maybe something I could share were just kind of like lessons that I or we learned by going through this. Again, I feel like I wanted to put this same disclaimer that I'm not trying to give universal guidance. There are people in the audience who are more experienced at this than I am, but it's still a self-reflection because maybe, I did this very recently. Maybe some students in the group are trying to do this for the first time, so not that far ahead. the first thing I realized was that I don't think that we could have gotten the right model at all, or even found a sensible question to ask without a domain expert. So I just don't see how that process would have happened for us. I don't think we could have just read papers. I don't think we could have just Googled stuff. I think we really needed to have an expert who could help us navigate it. Healthcare is a really complicated domain. Most social good domains are also pretty complicated. And for me, I would say the biggest thing that I've gotten from being a part of the MD4SG community was being able to meet domain experts, and specifically domain experts who were confident explaining all the details that might come up. So anytime we had a question like, is this kind of thing allowed? Is this what you're trying to accomplish? The domain expert was always confident answering that. And they also knew what the underlying objectives were. So that was helpful for us because we needed to, have answers to those questions to form a good model. The other thing that I think maybe caught me off guard at first was the only people I talked to for research before this were other theorists for the most part. And talking to other computer science theorists, we all have a lot of shared background. And I learned we were very lucky because, Mark, even though he's a domain expert in healthcare, he's also an economist. So we at least had a lot of significant shared language. But even then, I did notice that, talking to someone who does not have exactly the same background, that, I would just be more prepared that like, okay, it will take more time to explain what are the kinds of problems that I'm good at solving and to understand kind of like what the person I'm talking to is saying about what matters to their domain. And the other thing I got was when we first started this, I was like really self-conscious about like, why would this guy who's an expert in healthcare bother even responding to my email? And moreover, why would he like waste an hour of his time talking to a bunch of theorists about like why healthcare is important? But I was very pleasantly surprised at how willing Mark Shepard especially, but also other speakers that we had through the series were at engaging. And I would say that I do think it was a good decision on our part to maybe like really be hyper-focused when we engage with them and make sure that we did a lot of work in between successive interactions to make clear that we valued their time and that we really wanted make sure that they actually wanted to continue engaging with us. All right, so let me keep going. So the other kind of themes that I learned along the way was I think I learned how to better present my own expertise to people who don't know what theoretical CS is. So the one thing I learned that has worked well for me in other domains too. So for example, I also do research in cryptocurrencies, and I've learned that this description is also helpful for describing to applied researchers in cryptocurrencies what good is theoretical computer science or mechanism design. And I would say at least my style of research is that we're really good at isolating one aspect with simple models. And so for example, using this project as an example, the goal was to try and figure out how should you expect limiting entry to affect consumer utility. And I would say, again, at least for me, and at least, or maybe the narrow community I'm trying to represent, we don't typically outright solve real world problems. And that what we're good at is giving deep insight into one aspect. And the other thing that I learned was I learned the questions that I need to ask domain experts in order to have like an efficient and productive conversation. So for example, the way that I think through it is that, I'm good at optimizing, and what I need to know are like, what is the space that I'm allowed to optimize over? And I need to know, how do I evaluate a solution? And so a lot of the questions that now when I interact with domain experts, a lot of the questions that I ask are kind of geared towards these. So I ask a lot of questions like, okay, what am I allowed to do? What's the algorithm allowed to do? What's the market allowed to do? What's the designer allowed to do? How do the participants behave? What are the preferences of the participants? Are they fully strategic? And stuff like this. And the other thing I need to do is I need to understand what's the goal. So I ask like, okay, is there a clear metric that you use to evaluate what makes one solution better than another? Or if you don't have that, how do you decide that one solution is better than another one? And then eventually I'm trying to tease out through questions like this, sort of like, what would I set up as an objective function? So an oversimplification is, I would say, sort of like, we're good at finding optimal solutions as long as we know kind of like what the constraints are and what are the goals. And domain experts are good at defining the constraints and goals. And that without a domain expert, we would definitely solve a problem, but it would probably be the wrong constraints or the wrong goals. So that's, I think, an oversimplification of kind of like what I learned by going through this process. And the last thing I want to say is kind of like, so what did I get out of this process? So, we obviously didn't like solve healthcare, and that's fine. That wasn't, the ambitious goal going in. But I definitely learned a lot about healthcare. So I would say for me, I think that was a huge takeaway that I really valued. The way that I learn about things is I learn about things if I can do auction theory research related to it. So that's what we did. And now I understand healthcare better. And it prepared me for future discussions that maybe wound up being more applied or more applicable. So for example, recently I got involved in some discussions related to pooled testing for COVID, and I was way more confident having those discussions with a domain expert who was not not a algorithmist, not a theorist, not even in computer science. And I was much more prepared to have those conversations because I went through this process with MD4SG. I would also say, in terms of the research itself, I do think that the theory is useful, right? So I don't think it solved healthcare, but I really do think the theory is useful. It's obviously too stylized to directly impact policy. So I think that would be really irresponsible of me to go to a policymaker and say, we did this math, you should limit entry. I definitely don't believe that. But I do think that the foundations are helpful for future work. I do value theoretical foundations, and I do think that the field overall should value this stuff too. And of course, the highlight is that the reason I think the theory is at least somewhat useful is because we did try very hard to get the model right with an expert. Okay, so summary, quick reminder of the results. I presented very quickly a stylized model to study the impact of limiting entry on regulated exchanges. And I would say the takeaway is that under standard assumptions, and maybe after the discussion with Gabriel, maybe a good way to phrase it is, provided that the tails of the values for a single provider are not too heavy, limiting entry, you should expect it to improve consumer utility. And then the takeaway from the second part was I really benefited a lot from the MD4SG structure and community for facilitating sustained interaction with domain experts. And then also, thank you to the domain experts who continue showing up to these discussions and being engaged with the technical people here. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll let, I'll let the organizers navigate the discussion.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was a really wonderful talk, both parts for the theory and for understanding your pathway in solving this problem and learning from domain experts. So we want to open for discussion for everyone. Please feel free to add more questions in the chat or to raise your hands. There's already one raised hand and one question in the chat. So let's go with the first one. Gabriel, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that was really cool, Matt. And I mean, in general, just this whole group, I think it's amazing what you're doing. And I think it's super valuable. Like, I mean, you described it, Matt, like really well to write a model. Irene, I think, was also writing something similar in the chat to write these models talking to domain experts. It's just, and then you end up with something that is relevant. So I think that has been also our experience in what we've done. So one thing, if I may, if I would add is, I would also push you to like try to close the circle. Like you talk to like domain experts, you did your model, and I think sort of closing the circle, like going back to practitioners is, that's where you can really have an impact. And I think it's also like very fulfilling to see that you kind of close that circle. And I think that may require more work. So for example, like in what we did in Chile with like procurement, that actually required writing a slightly more realistic model, but we couldn't solve analytically. And at the end, what we presented were like numerical simulations, but they were like really powerful to convince policymakers. Yeah, so I would like just maybe one. This is great, but maybe one comment would be like I would push people to try to close the circle. Like I think that's like practitioners would benefit. you would benefit. I think it's really like a win, a win-win. Like going this like extra mile to maybe writing that a bit slightly more realistic model that you can, but then maybe it's like easier to communicate, and then even if it's just numerics. Yeah.
So I was looking at the most recent questions in chat. I mean, I can definitely give my opinion for what I would try to do next. It sounds like maybe Gabriel or maybe someone else in the audience would be a better person to answer what they have done and what they suspect will work. So I don't know, I'm happy to say what I would try to do next, but for both of those questions about directly impacting policy, like I said, I don't have that experience yet. So I can say what I would try to do. But if there's someone who has been more successful, they might be a better person to answer that.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, so so I can say what I would try is, so for this specific project, or let me just read the first question out loud, was how do you think domain experts should use results like this one? So should they take it as weak evidence for some conclusion in the real world, or should they ignore it until the field is matured? And how do you communicate this to domain experts? So I would say what I would do, again, with all the caveats and disclaimers, is I would say it's evidence that it should be investigated further. So I wouldn't say that it's weak evidence. So I would say sort of like if you were forced to make a decision, you know, within a few months from now, and all you did was you got me to write a theory paper, that was a bad plan to, you know, to try and make that decision. And I just don't think, I don't think that it's really enough to inform a real world decision. But I do think maybe it's enough to suggest, okay, if you want to do some experiments or if you want to do some simulations, you know, there's such a huge design space of things that you can simulate. There's such a huge design space of experiments you could try. And I do think that the theory suggests maybe the experiments or the simulations that you should try to do first. So I think that's, if I was going to interact with a domain expert and just say, how do you parse this result? That's how I would suggest it. I definitely want to leave that if anyone has a better answer, that I'm not confident that's the best answer, but that's what I would try to do. And for the follow-up question about saying a few more words about the pathway to it being more useful for healthcare policy, or what would future work that builds on this one need to answer? I would say so the same, what I would do is I would I would go back to the same, domain expert, and I would say, okay, just iterate through the same process. Here's what we were able to do. Presumably this does not yet tell you what to do in practice. And I would just ask what part of it is not convincing for you in practice? Is it because there's something overly simplifying in the model? And then I would go back and try and change that about the model. Is it because at the end of the day, it's just theory and you want simulations or something more? And then I would go back. I don't have technical expertise in doing good simulations, but maybe I would try to find a collaborator who was good at something like that. But I think all that I would think to do is I would just go back. I would just iterate the same process with the expert and say, what about this is the biggest reason that it doesn't yet tell you what to do in practice? And then I would try to change that. And then I would just have that iterated conversation over. And that's basically what we did to go from the bad models to the good models in the first place. And at least for me, that was entirely within theory. So even though it was new, it was at least comfortable because it was all theoretical. Going beyond that would be a pretty big step for me. So I'm not really sure what that would look like for me, but that's what I would try to do.
I wanted to jump in and make a comment that, I think Matt also mentioned in his talk that, in his caveats for how he thinks this work should be used, he sort of mentioned that this has made him feel much more comfortable in talking with domain experts. And I kind of view this work also in this general vein of giving an entry point for conversations. So I could imagine Matt using this as have you considered this aspect of how the market is set up? And you sort of demonstrate through this that you know enough about the domain to sort of engage in a meaningful conversation with a domain expert. And you also illustrate somehow, here are the kinds of things that I can show using my tools. So I think it gives like a really concrete starting point if you want to have future collaborations. So that's also like another way this conversation would go. Maybe this particular finding never finds its way into policy, but I think something like this is a great way to start conversations where people can identify, oh, I know this is what you work on now because I see an example that's kind of in my language. Here's something else that I have no idea how to solve. Can you help?
Can I just also add that I agree with Irene, but I will also add that, I don't know, you may also be surprised that maybe even people like running these exchanges, I don't know, maybe they've never thought that restricting entry is a good idea. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so for example, just showing, even if it's a very stylized model, that I think the magnitudes really matter here. So we would need to show, I think, it's like a plot, like showing this, listen, in this variety of markets, you know, this is this is the impact that restricting entry could have. And I think a plot like that, even if it's over a stylized, and you don't need to oversell, you say this is like a very stylized market and blah, blah, but it may give some order of magnitude. I think that could be pretty powerful, just quantifying the effect.
Yeah, actually totally agree with you, Gabriel. And I was going to ask if you had anything to add, because I think of everyone on this call, Gabriel has had many, many years of experience interacting with domain experts.
I'm not sure about it, but like, but one in my experience, I think typically domain experts have an intuition. They have, most of the time, the right intuition, but I think just quantifying things is so powerful. It's like very different to think that, I think competition helps. That to say, you know, if you introduce competition, you can increase like consumer surplus by 30%. That's like, I think, very, very different. And at least in my experience, that has convinced authorities or policymakers to make a change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these comments. There's another raised hand by Jeremy Lauer. If you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. And I found this really interesting. I only joined maybe 20 minutes in, so I think I missed some of the setup. But I would describe myself as a domain expert. I'm an economist who was working at the World Health Organization for 25 years, and I just started. I changed fields. I'm now in academia in management science at Strathclyde University, and what I'm really interested in this field of mechanism design and algorithmic game theory, and I would say also sort of Hamming codes and induction puzzles, where we sort of change the frame of the problem, but has a lot of the same structure. It has a lot of the same asymptotics. Is that one of the fundamental problems with healthcare is that people really don't understand their health state really well. So there's a lot of ignorance about what is your health state. And, if you think about an induction problem like a hat puzzle or something like that, where people don't know their health state, but they see something about the range of variables in the universe of outcomes, right? And I think that is a really interesting analogy for healthcare, where, I think one of the things I would like to see Matt, this is now like focusing in on Matt and the presentation, is that it seems like a lot of your presentation was assuming that people know which plan is best for them, right? And therefore an auction can solve that problem. I'm wondering if we can flip that and say, people actually don't know what plan is best for them, and that they need to solve an induction puzzle to get the plan. The main point I'm trying to make here, and I'll sum it up, is that people are really ignorant about their health state and about the health production function. And I think, if we can use some of these results from a range of theories like mechanism design, algorithmic game theory, induction puzzles, Hamming codes, to try to find what are the analogies that express and give us some traction on that fundamental problem. I think it is really policy relevant what you're doing, but I think we can get it more policy relevant if we can actually solve that fundamental ignorance problem where people, they don't see the color of their own hat, but they see a lot of other people's hats.
Can I ask a question? Do you think that their lack of ability to evaluate their health state and what would be best for them is just not knowing their health state, or do you think it's because of the lack of transparency in the current state of healthcare? Do you think that they need to figure out what their health state is, or do you think that if the healthcare and the way of buying healthcare was different, that would solve part of the problem? Or do you think it's really just figuring out the health state?
I think it's a fundamental ignorance about how to preserve, refurbish, and maintain health capital. In economics, the fundamental theoretical model here is Michael Grossman's in 1972 health capital model. And if we had knowledge about our health production function, even up to kind of linear first order homogeneous knowledge, we would be like way ahead of where we actually are. We really don't know what makes us healthy. And if you think about, the kind of knowledge that we have, it's stuff like avoid pathogens, sleep well, eat well, exercise a little bit. There's not like detailed knowledge about how to really maximize our health capital and shepherd our health capital. And that's sort of really astounding for such a fundamental element of well-being, that that there's so little knowledge about how to live healthier, longer lives. We have a vast kind of body of medical knowledge that might seem to falsify my statement, but what I'm saying is that when you boil it down, there's really not that much that tells the average consumer, don't smoke, don't drink too much, stuff like this. But these are really like the kind of heuristics that we have, and they're not a very rich set of heuristics. And most people even have trouble kind of comprehending and implementing those basic heuristics. So beyond the fundamental ignorance, then there's a problem about how do we integrate that knowledge? How do we empower people to act on it? And there, I think mechanism design can be really helpful in terms of empowering people to, act on the little bits of knowledge that we do have. I hope that was responsive, Kira. It was a little rambling.
No, It was great. I took notes.
Yeah, I was also just going to say, just to give a parallel response to Kira, that again, just since people were asking, the thought process that kind of I go through when I hear what Jeremy is saying is sort of that is definitely not that is not an aspect that I've considered in basic mechanism design questions before. And I'm starting to think through sort of okay, if I wanted to study only this aspect, the first thing I would try to do is come up with some single item auction design problem and try to bake in some aspect where the consumers fundamentally don't know their value or something like that. And I don't know how I would get started with that, but that's to the extent that anyone finds it interesting to hear my thought process, that's the thought process I would go through, understanding that obviously single item auctions all the way to healthcare is a huge jump. But I would say the style of research that comes out from CS theory, intersect mechanism design, I think would start with a question like that and then say, okay, now we've got some fundamental understanding of how not knowing your value for something can impact mechanism design. And then from there, try to extend it to more general settings. But that's for example, just to highlight that thought process, I would start with something super simple and completely acknowledge that a single item is extremely different than healthcare. But try to start there and then eventually build up. But that is a fundamental. It's a new fundamental idea that I'm not aware of, or certainly I've never tried to do within mechanism design research before.
Well, I mean, I think. So could I just follow up really quickly? I think that auctions and mechanism design, they find ways to share information across the space of realizations, right? Often auctions have multiple rounds, there are different rules for auctions. And this is a way of sharing information about values such that each individual can make a better individual decision. And I think that is like a really important analogy for healthcare. That's all I have to say. Oh, and I would just say, I'm late coming to this meeting. I hope there can be more, not just about healthcare, because I'm interested in all social goods. And that in my department, there are people that actually do algorithmic game theory and computer science. So enough of an advertisement. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess jumping off of what Matt was saying, I similarly was thinking, if we were going to distill this down, what is the one aspect here? And then every time Jeremy talks, I'm like, oh, there's a connection to something I know in mechanism design, interdependent value model, and I'm writing it down. And then, oh, here's something I've never thought about before. How would we embed this into the model?
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful discussion, Jeremy and everyone. I also wonder, related to that, whether there's some connection with social learning, where in some of these issues where we're trying to disseminate some information that's competing with alternative informations, like in regarding like smoking that you said, right? Like we get different parties that try to disseminate different kinds of messages. So how can we use mechanism design to get the right message out together with some knowledge that we know from social learning? But that might be a long topic to think about. I want to make sure that we get any other questions that people may have. So please raise your hands or add them to the chat if you have any other thoughts or comments. No? All right. I think we can stop here then. Thank you again for the great discussion. Thank you, Matt, and Kira and Miriam for joining us, and for the wonderful talk. I'm going to link in the chat the paper that Matt has been talking about, and we hope to continue this discussion offline as well. And thank you all for your great questions.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.